From the Denver Broncos Media Center, welcome to Broncos Country Tonight.
Welcome to Broncos Country Tonight as we take a look around the AFC West post-free agency. See where the Broncos sort of stack up with the Chiefs, the Chargers, as well as the Las Vegas Raiders. And I want to start, Ben, with the Raiders, as they had probably the biggest change of the entire division. They're going with Jimmy Garoppolo at starting quarterback, at least unless they decide to draft a quarterback in the top 10. But we'll just say, for argument's sake, it's Jimmy Garoppolo right now. They traded Darren Waller to the Giants. Those are pretty significant moves. Now, of course, the Raiders also picked up the franchise tag for Josh Jacobs, so he's going to be back, and that's not great news for the Broncos because he always has his best games against Denver. But starting with the Raiders, that was some of their biggest moves. But the Broncos have really had a tough time winning against that team over the last few years, even with a new coach there in Josh McDaniels.
Well, I think the style of defense the Broncos played matched up really well against Kansas City and very poorly against the Raiders. And I think that's changing. I think you're now going to run a defense that matches up very, very well against the Raiders and Chargers and very poorly against Kansas City. But we'll see how they're able to execute. At least schematically, it's not what has shown to slow down Kansas City and Pat Mahomes, but it is what's shown to slow down what Josh McDaniels runs. I don't know that moving on from Derek Carr and Darren Waller for Jimmy Garoppolo and O.J. Howard is that feels like a giant downgrade to me, and we've all been privy to Josh McDaniels' downgrades before, but that just feels like a giant downgrade. I like O.J. Howard. I just feel like he just was never used properly anywhere he went. Jimmy Garoppolo, he'll be the starter for the Raiders, even if they draft somebody. He'll be the starter, at least initially. He's an efficient distributor of the football, loves in-breaking stuff inside the numbers, doesn't really like to throw it deep unless you're wide open, and doesn't really throw it outside the numbers much. He could pick on the flats. I mean, he would be a guy that would be good against what the Broncos used to do on defense, but I don't know that he is particularly now. I don't see that team having much success. Felt like they downgraded the offense and really haven't done much on the defensive side to me to be any better, and their defense was where they were atrocious. So it feels like Josh is doing his Josh thing and just driving a franchise into the ground where everybody hates him and going to leave it in tatters.
It's going to be interesting, and you certainly understand why he wants to bring in guys he has familiarity with, right? I mean, that's what happens when you bring in your own quarterback. When he got to Denver, he was trying to bring in Matt Castle, right? He wanted a guy that he had that experience with. And so bringing in Jimmy Garoppolo doesn't really surprise anybody, but I'm with you just on the surface of it. I think most people would say Derek Carr, just as an individual quarterback and his ability, is ahead of Jimmy Garoppolo, but Jimmy Garoppolo won a lot of games. And the one thing that we talk about in this league, when you get down to it, whether you want to really judge a quarterback by wins or not, it's a little bit of a flawed metric. It's about winning. And so Jimmy Garoppolo does know how to help teams do that.
Well, yeah, and he's been around. He certainly can get to a Super Bowl with Jimmy Garoppolo. Of course, you need a great defense, strong run game, and elite speed at receiver, none of which the Raiders actually have. But
Devontae Adams is still there.
Yeah, but I mean, you got Devontae Adams. You have one receiver. I wouldn't call him an elite speed guy, but he's an elite receiver. At the end of the day, though, I mean, you're not. I don't think that team is built to compete. There's a reason everybody's picking them last, and Vegas has them in the cellar of the division.
Okay, let's get to the Chargers. The Chargers are in a really unique situation because they got to put themselves in position to pay their quarterback. And by next year, they're going to have 4 players, including their 2 top wide receivers, all with over $30 million cap hits. And Khalil Mack, I think, is in that conversation too. So the Chargers are approaching a bill is due kind of moment. Not a ton of splashy things here in the offseason. So for the Broncos, it is they've actually played pretty competitively against the Chargers, right? Splitting with them over the last couple of years. Where do they stack up now?
Well, they've had Nasir Adderley retired. They've had a fefew defections, I think, that are kind of big for them. They can never seem to get the offensive line right.
Brought back Pipkins.
Yeah, but I mean, they can't pay Herbert right now. They don't have the cash. Eckler says he's underpaid and wants more money, or he wants a trade, and they're
allowing him to
trying to shop him. You've got the receivers; they lack elite deep speed. You bring in Kellen Moore in to run a little bit different offense, so it won't just all be shallow crossers and then trying to run that sail concept all the time. They'll actually have some diversity on their offense, but end of the day, I don't know if that represents an appreciable upgrade if they don't have any speed pushing the limits of the field with their cannon arm quarterback. The offense is capable of scoring in bunches because they have a ton of talent, but a lot of that's Justin Herbert covering for the fact that they don't have elite speed at receiver and their offensive line kind of sucks. And then you've got Austin Eckler, who has just been, absolutely amazing. They trade him. I don't know what they're going to do there. On the defensive side of the ball, they have all the pieces to be successful, and yet somehow just not a great defense. I mean, you've got on paper what looks like a top 5 defense in the NFL, and then on the field, it's middle of the road. They can definitely be run on. You can gash them in the run game. And even adding Khalil Mack and to Joey Bosa, I don't think that really made all that much of a difference. So
Bosa was out for quite a bit.
He was,
yes.
but I mean, even when they were together, it just didn't feel like an elite defense. It still felt like you could kind of do what you wanted.
Which is remarkable since you hired a defensive-minded coach, right?
I mean, Brandon Staley, a Vic Fangio acolyte, to run what Vic was running, and it just doesn't. It's a team that has all the pieces to be challenging Kansas City, and somehow finds a way to snatch mediocrity from the roster that looks like it could get greatness.
You do wonder, and we'll really test to see how this is going to play out for the Chargers this year, but you do wonder the way they lost that game in the playoffs, if that's going to have some implications, right? Because, I mean, even for the head coach, right? I mean, if you're that team and you're seeing that kind of collapse, you find a way to rally around it, or do you recognize the end is near for a lot of the way this team is made up for? Like I said, you got 4 guys you might be moving on from as soon as next year in the process of trying to pay your quarterback. This is a completely remade team, and it's about to be that, and including the coach. So you do wonder from the Chargers side of things how they're sort of able to keep it all together with duct tape at this point.
Well, right. I think anything that adds an expense to the Chargers is not going to be something that's done. So if firing Brandon Staley costs them money, they're not going to do it. They just don't have the money to pay Herbert because, we talk about the funding rule. The funding rule is guaranteed money in a contract has to go into escrow 2 weeks after. You have to have that cash on hand. And the Spanos are one of the poorest owners in the NFL. So it's going to be tough for them to make that happen.
Okay. And finally, the Kansas City Chiefs, the defending Super Bowl champions. And that one right there, I think you ask any Broncos fans, any otherwise, they're going to say that's the one you have to continue to chase. The Broncos have lost 15 straight to them. And again, you're talking about Super Bowl champion versus a 5-win team. We're talking about a Grand Canyon size difference into where the visibility of these two teams is right now. But they did move on from both their offensive tackles. They did bring in Taylor from Jacksonville Jaguars. But they're a team that is seemingly able to do that. They can rebuild their offensive line on the fly. Juju Smith-Schuster is now in New England. But otherwise, they are going to still be very good because they still have Andy Reid and they still have Patrick Mahomes.
They're doing a reload, and Andy Reid has proven he can do that before. You go back and look at his Philadelphia Eagles tenures. If they lost tackles or they lost receivers, he just reloaded with new guys, and the system kept right on going. And that figures to be it. Juju, I don't think that's a big loss. The receivers, I think the tackles may affect them a little bit, but Jawan Taylor's not bad. He's certainly a decent tackle. And then, Pat Mahomes helps make everybody around him a little bit better. So the key for Kansas City is going to be when Kelsey slows down. When does Kelsey lose a step? Because that changes the dynamic of what that offense does. And last year, Kansas City kind of switched things up. They went to more 2 tight, started running the ball a lot more. And I think the Broncos are going to follow suit with that this year. I think their offense is going to be a lot more ground and pound. And then, just taking advantage and taking their shots rather than have Pat Mahomes slinging the ball over the yard, although he still does that. So defensively, they had a couple of defections as well. And I mean, I don't think it's enough to knock them off their perch. I don't think they're as good. I don't think they're going to be as good this coming season as they were last year. But I still think they're the top team in the division.
It's hard to argue, right? I mean, and even last year when they moved on from Tyreek Hill, a lot of the debate is like, oh, well, the Chiefs might take a step back or so. And what did they do? They went on and win a championship, and Pat Mahomes wins the MVP. So I think until the Broncos show a competency to even split with them in season, we can't even have conversations about closing the gap. Because at this point, that's the next step. It's not even – and the Broncos have to focus on themselves, and that's what they've done here in free agency, spending more than any other team. But what the Broncos are trying to do now is put the best product out there on the field. They got to snap that losing streak. And then from there, you can build into how does that reset them in the AFC. But until then, I think you're 100% right. It is the Chiefs' not only division but conference to lose.
Pretty much, yeah. I agree. I think that the way the AFC West stacks up is Kansas City, and then you kind of got the Chargers and Broncos, and the Raiders are kind of just languishing there in last. I think if you're Denver and you want to compete, we have to get away from the philosophy that you have to keep up with Kansas City. We got to shred that because nobody can do it. Even Cincinnati, look at what they built, and they still couldn't do it. Right? Buffalo, look what they've been able. Couldn't do it. So I think end of the day, if you're Denver, your philosophy needs to we're going to build the best team we can build and then go do what we do. And Kansas City is going to have to beat us instead of we need to try to keep pace with Kansas City because face it, nobody else has Patrick Mahomes.
That's it. No, that's right. And how many teams not only since Patrick Mahomes was drafted, but will for the next decade plus be chasing what Patrick Mahomes does for the Kansas City Chiefs. There's only so many of those kinds of players. Well, first of all, there's only one Patrick Mahomes, but there's only so many of those kinds of quarterbacks in the league. But every single team feels like if we're not already having one on our roster, we need to be trying to get one. But in the meantime, there are, there's 52 other positions on your roster that needed to be addressed. And sometimes in the effort to chase the quarterback, you do sometimes miss those things. So it's great when you have one of those, but if you don't have one of those, that means you're going to have to find another way.
Yeah, and I think the way to do that is just kind of what the Broncos are doing, scaling it back, going to bully ball, getting nasty blockers up front, and taking it to almost a Tennessee Titans-like level where we're just going to bash the you-know-what out of you and dare you to stop it, and we will keep pace with you that way.
Right, and we saw the Tennessee Titans, by the way, on the road with, was it Malik Willis, yeah, starting in that game, and they were up a couple scores on the Kansas City Chiefs early on, and I mean, I think if it was Ryan Tannehill in that game, they actually probably find a way to complete that win. But that was the way they did it. They just kept running the ball and basically keeping the Chiefs on the sideline.
Teams the Chiefs have struggled with have been physical on defense and physical on offense and just wore them down, and that's what it is. I mean, I know Cincinnati's kept pace with them a couple times, but they actually were a physical football team, so much so the Broncos went out and got one of the running backs that out-physicaled Kansas City, so...
Right, absolutely. All right, that's a look around the AFC West. For Benjamin Allbright, I'm Ryan Edwards. Thanks for watching Broncos Country Tonight.
Denver's going to win! You can stand up and salute in Denver, and you got the world champions that live in your town.